I was I was driving up here just now, and you know how the cops, they do that thing where they drive across the road back and forth and eventually stop their car perpendicular on the road after having slowed down traffic, usually if there's an accident up ahead. We got caught just behind that. Now, you know, I'm 50 years old, so I've actually been the car behind the cop car, like the first car, pole position. I've also sometimes been able to get around them, you know, like they're doing their thing, and if you're right there, and they can't, where they're going to chase you, they're busy doing something else. But, you know, I was probably about 100 yards back, so whatever that was, I don't know, you know, 30 cars back, something like that, you know. So anyway, we stopped, and I always try to remember that when I'm stopped in traffic, that someone's having a way worse day than me. When there's an accident or something like that. That there's somebody who's suffering way more than I am and who's been, you know, potentially suffering a tragedy, whereas I'm suffering an extremely mild inconvenience. I try to keep that in mind. I've never really suffered from road rage. Raise your hand if you ever suffer from road rage. Yeah, it's a fairly common experience. I've never really suffered from road rage. Now, I'm clever. I try not to drive when there's a lot of traffic. So I try to organize my life in such a way where I don't get caught in traffic. And I'm from LA, so I grew up with a lot of traffic and learning how to navigate through traffic and alternate routes, you know, pre-Waze, pre-cell phones. When I was growing up, there were no cell phones even. And so you learn the roads and talk to other people and figured stuff out. And in my community growing up, the goal was never to stop your car. So you take an alternate route just to keep your car moving forward. And the goal was to never stop driving forward. And so we'd pick an alternate route that might not save us more than a minute or two, but if we could avoid having to stop, that was the goal of life. Jayadev is from the same community I'm from, so he does the same thing. We do the same thing. We also notice that people drive in pods, where the road might not be busy, but you'll have 15 cars all driving together, and then there's a big empty space. You have to navigate the pods. If you're driving quickly, you move from one pod to another, and there's lots of empty space in between. It's almost like small towns that you're traveling between, but those pods slow you down. If you break free from a pod, you can go a lot faster until you get to the next one. And so, but the goal is always to never really slow down. Anyway, we got caught in this little full stop situation. Turns out somebody's tire blown out. They were driving on the metal. So, it was probably, and their car looked banged up. So I'm thinking they probably went into the wall or something like that. There weren't two cars, there was just one car. So I think just one person's tire blew out and they banged into the wall. This was just pre-CSULB, getting off the 22 when it's turning into 7th Street. 22 is a far out freeway. 7th Street is a very old road. It predates the 405. And so when they built the 405 in the 60s, then they took a portion of the 22, but pre-405, 7th Street just continued all the way to Santa Ana. But then when they built the 405, it cut right through that, and so they took a section of 7th Street, and which was the 22, and then that became the 405, which is why you've got these two parts of 7th Street cut by the 405, is because it was one street previously. You would only appreciate this if you're from Orange County and you drive that road regularly. You drive the road regularly. Did you know what I just told you? Yeah, I Googled it. Not today, years ago. I was trying to figure out why is there a 22 that becomes 7th Street, and then there's a 22 East, which goes to Santa Ana, and it's cut by the 405. It's because that was the road, and the 405 came in the 60s and took it over. Anyway, when I was a kid driving the 405 down to San Diego, it was all orange groves. Off the 405. Farms and orange groves off the 405. Irvine didn't exist. Irvine was just orange groves and farms. You have a few farms left on the 405. They seem totally bizarre and out of place. Those few farms that speckle the 405 in various spots. There's one right around Huntington or Westminster. You see a couple of cows there. It's right on the side of the 405 freeway. That was the entire 405 south of Long Beach, north of San Diego. It was wild. Anyway, we got stopped, and as a result of getting stopped, and I like I said, I try to never get upset at people if they create a traffic jam. If people road rage on me and they yell at me from their because they're protected by their car, right? If people road rage on me, then it's a different story. Then I get irritated. People want to scream at me like a keyboard warrior, but they're not in the safety of a keyboard. They're just in a car, which I could potentially get to. And so then it's a different story. But if it's just the inconvenience of a traffic jam, I just tolerate it. Because again, I tried to do the math and I realized someone's having a much worse day than me. And I try to follow that golden rule of treating others as I would want to be treated myself if I was in a similar circumstance. But anyway, as a result of stopping there, it looks like to me to be an oil refinery, is what I'm assuming it is, in Long Beach. And there's an oil refinery kind of, by the water there a little bit in Long Beach. And you can see it when you're coming off the 22, and it's on your left-hand side when you're driving into Long Beach off the 22 northbound. So you're going north on the 405, get off on the 22, and there's this oil refinery right there just before you get to Cal State Long Beach. And my daughter says, "Why is that making smoke?" And I said, "Oh, that's a cloud maker." And she said, "It's a cloud maker?" She said, "It looks like smoke." And I said, "Okay, it's smoke." And she said, "Well, then why did you say it was a cloud maker?" This is my 5-year-old. And I said, "Well, your older brother Rukta, when he was 5, 6, 7, he saw the same smokestack and he thought it was a cloud maker. And he asked me, what are those cloud makers doing there? And so I remembered that, and so I said it to you. He was 7, she was 5, and she's like, why would Rukta think it was making clouds? I'm like, he was young, and she's like, well, that's so silly. And she kept going on about it. She probably brought it up 4 or 5 times. Just in the 8 minutes it took for me to get from CSULB to here, she brought it up 4 or 5 times. It was like she was just really enjoying herself, like laughing to herself, just thinking it was just the funniest thing in the world. Just over and over again bring it up. And kids are like that. It's almost like they have senile dementia. Below a certain age, they seem like they have Alzheimer's because they just keep bringing the same point up again. Yeah, but it's not a cloud maker. He thought it was a cloud maker. Like that was so funny. And that made me think of what we're going to talk about today. So that's the event that gave rise to tonight's class. I speak somewhat formally most days, and so I don't spend a ton. Generally speaking, I don't prepare for class. I used to, but I speak most days publicly, and so I don't generally prepare for class because I'm a good public speaker and I can speak extemporaneously and I can think on my feet and I can make the magic happen even without any prep. And so not only is it more, congruent with my lifestyle and just easier on the treads, on the tires of my life to not have to prep for every class, but I don't find I need to in order to make an impression on people and teach effectively. That might sound arrogant, but I don't think it's arrogance to have a clear understanding of your abilities. Being unnecessarily proud or delusional, these start to be symptoms of arrogance. But to just be aware of your actual skills is not arrogance. In fact, it becomes some kind of twisted reverse arrogance of self-loathing if you're unable to recognize your own skills. You get a pretty girl and she thinks she's really ugly, or you get a person who's in great shape and they think they're fat. At some point, you start to feel like they have some kind of mental disorder, that they're unable to clearly see what is. Some kind of body dysmorphia or some kind of, really mental disease. And so we should be able to see our flaws. We should also be able to see our good qualities and just dispassionately own them, because if you're a qualified fireman and you, because of self-loathing and low self-esteem, think you're not, and somebody burns up in a building because you're not aware of what your skill set is vis-a-vis everybody else, and you don't jump when you're supposed to jump and act when you're supposed to act, and you end up deferring to other people because of some kind of mental disease, and then the world becomes a worse place because you don't jump when you should jump, and you don't move when you should move, and you don't step up and step into harm's way and lean into things and leap into breach because of some artificial deficiency you delusionally imagine you have, and your inability to recognize your actual skill set. So I think it's important that we learn to recognize our blind spots and where we need work and our weak links, but we also need to recognize what we do right and what we're good at. Thank you, Damodar. What we do right. I thank Damodar because I don't like looking at people who are here blocked by the camera because it makes it difficult for me to see you. Don't worry about it. Damodar recognizes that and moved to the side so I can get a real clean look at his face. Thank you. So I'm a good public speaker. Anyone want to argue with me on that point? Anyways, I think of things, as I'm driving around or as I'm going about my day, and those things turn into a class. If I have a text to go by, it's a different story. Then I try to stay close to the text and be chaste and faithful to the text. But sometimes I also just want to speak what's on my mind. I think there's validity there. And sometimes I think of a verse that speaks to what I want to speak about. And sometimes I don't even worry about that. I just speak what I want to speak about, which is probably what we're going to do today. I did think of a verse, but we don't have to refer to it. We'll see. I also learned that I read a paper on how to give a sermon written 100+ years ago, maybe 150 years ago, by a Christian minister. And he made the point that there's two kinds of speeches. Either you teach what the Bible says, or you say what you want to say, but you find a verse from the Bible that supports it. So either I just go in like a blank slate and I look at the text and I analyze and speak from the text and jump off from the text, or I have an idea and I find a text which supports the thing I want to talk about. That second one just requires that you're not speaking about some spastic thing like the rides at Knott's Berry Farm and or something like that. Or the jams they sell there, and how it originally was an actual working berry farm, and then it turned into an amusement park. That you don't just speak about any random nonsense, but your thoughts naturally are valuable and faithful to the tradition. If your mind is not automatically faithful to the tradition, then you might have to just look at the verses and speak from them, because otherwise you got too much garbage stewing around in your head to speak in a valuable way. But as our tradition seeps into your bones, so to speak, then naturally your thoughts become more naturally in line with and congruent with our tradition, and you have a little more freedom because you naturally move in the right way. I used to sell paintings, and an ex-pro boxer one time, he found out I did mixed martial arts, and he said to me, well, what would you do if I put you in a choke? And he meant a front headlock. I said, I don't know. Why don't you put me in a choke? We'll see what I do. Because there's a bunch of different potential defenses based on what the choke looks like. There's a bunch of possibilities of what you could do, depending on what how much pressure they put on your neck and what they do with their body, and so there's a bunch of different options. So rather than I was in his home, I was selling him paintings. I was hanging a painting I'd sold him up in his home, and somehow he asked me this question, like he'd always wondered, what would you do? He just thought, and so I said, well, go ahead and put me in a choke. He said, really? I'm like, yeah, go for it. Do your thing. So he put me in a choke, and then I just felt what his body felt like in that moment, and just, defended it. Does that make sense? And then you get comfortable enough, and you can just move with things, and naturally you move in the right way. If you're not adept enough, if you don't have enough of that, enough expertise in a given field, then structure and books and systems are your friend. But at a certain point, those systems become really natural, and you can just flow. I was speaking to one of my teachers once. He's old now. He's probably in his late 70s. He's a scientist. And I asked him, for maybe some of his best arguments against atheism, something like that. I just had a rough discussion with a scientist, and I couldn't quite win. I held my own. it was hard to win. This was maybe, 20 plus years ago. I couldn't quite get him where I wanted him. He was too wily and I wasn't adept enough. And so I was asking this professional scientist, who's also a member of our tradition, what he would have said in that circumstance. And he explained to me, he said, I can't give you an answer. He said, it's like a tennis match. I sometimes use this example with you guys. I can teach you a good serve. I can teach you a way to start an argument. I can teach you a response to a specific point. But in any high-level discussion, you have to anticipate that the person's going to come back at you. And so there's no opening shot, which is also a coup de grace at the same time. There's no opening shot which also ends the debate. A one statement conversation ender. Philosophical debates against adept opponents are just not that easy. So you have to have a good serve, kind of like your opening salvo if you're engaged in warfare, and then your opponent, your interlocutor in the debate, is going to come back at you. They're not going to just roll over and die. It's not going to be one and done. Like in a rap battle where you bust such a great rhyme, the guy just falls over and everybody cheers your name and puts you on their shoulders and you're the winner. It just doesn't work like that. Against a serious opponent, whatever you come at them with, they're going to come back at you. And so there's a back and forth like in a tennis match. And you got a good opener, you got a strong opener. And against an unskilled opponent, that'll be enough to finish them. But against a skilled opponent, that's your opening shot. Like a quick kill in chess, or a quick kill in jiu-jitsu, or a quick kill in a fist fight. Sometimes it works. Sometimes you walk out, front kick the guy in the face, and he's just done, and that's it. You just walked out, stomped him in the face, and that was it. Fight's over. It happens. Even professionally, you see that sometimes it happens. Some guys open up with a flying kick, and they win the fight from the flying kick. It's rare, though. Usually that gymnastic, sensational, ostentatious, dramatic opener leaves you open to solid counters, and now you're on the back foot if your opponent knows how to contend with that. And so there's no fast track. You simply have to become skilled and masterful at the subject that you want to specialize in. And it takes years. And you no longer look for the quick kill or the easy finish because you don't need one. Maybe they're bells and whistles. They're condiments, they're accoutrements. But you got a solid foundation, and if you need to, you can dig as deep as you need to go and stay in it. You hone your craft, but not with a bunch of one-hit wonders, with a solid portfolio that you can deal with whatever comes your way. He was explaining this to me about the nature of debate, about the nature of arguing theism versus atheism, and how you just have to spend the time and learn all the arguments and understand different perspectives and specialize in whatever subjects you want to specialize in and get really good at them and be up to date on all the latest literature. And sometimes study thousands of years of discussion on a topic, including stuff which is published currently. There's current research coming out. You guys following this? Harvard just published a study that community is what makes people happy. Positive psychology has published a number of studies that a sense of purpose, living for a higher purpose is what gives people happiness. But Harvard just did a big study, and it was community, being part of a community, specifically. Even above working for some higher purpose, it's just being a part of a community, which itself creates some higher, more broad sense of self. Anyway, yeah, there's no one-hit wonder. And eventually you have to be able to open strong and then just roll with things in whatever direction they go in. I did lose my train of thought though. What was I tangenting on when I made that point?
You're talking about how you can get up there and just talk about anything you don't prepare for class.
There you go. Yeah, it's almost better. And so if you get adept to a certain level, you can just have thoughts, and those thoughts are naturally going to be spiritualized. You almost do better work. People get to see you reacting, and they get to see real life stuff, and it's more fun for everybody. It's way more organic. Before you become masterful, then structure, systems are your friend, but there's a limit to them because they can never anticipate everything that might happen. And so you're always, in some ways, weak because that structure eventually becomes a cage. And when things fall outside the structure, which they inevitably will in a live environment, you don't know how to handle them because you're too married to the structure. So there's that, like the structure starts you, and at some point the structure becomes a cage. You got to jump off from the structure, and that structure has to become embodied enough that you can start to flow, and that's where the science becomes art. And that's where the lessons come to life. And that's where you do original work in real life as you deal in real time with whatever life throws at you. All of you would understand this because all of you are good at something. And that thing you're really good at, you would have made this journey. You would have moved from being married to structure, or being a dabbler, to learning something, to being married to structure, to being able to have imbibed that structure enough that you can start to what do I want to say? Jump off of that structure. You can start to innovate. You can start to become creative. You can start to become artistic and spontaneous. And then beautiful things happen. I like to shoot for that. Shoot for the stars. And the freedom of not having so much structure sometimes is beauty comes out of that. The scriptures also, if you can get in line with them, they will wow you every time you read them, and new stuff will come out that you never thought of before. But anyway, I read an article 20 years ago when I was in my 20s, 20 plus years ago, when I was myself in my 20s. I'm 50 now, so I would have been in my late 20s, 28, 29, somewhere like that. I read an article in a magazine, like a magazine, like a men's magazine, but for not lusty men. Like men's magazines, usually there's a big lust factor. I think it was Men's Journal is what I read, or it might have been an offshoot of Men's Journal. It only got published for a short period of time. But it was, and I actually bought the magazine. That's how good it was. You used to go to a bookstore and I read periodicals at a bookstore, like a Borders or a Barnes and Nobles, and so I maybe once a month or once every couple months, I'd find myself at a bookstore and I would check out what's around, and then sometimes they'd have philosophical magazines as well, quarterly philosophical reviews and different stuff that I didn't want to subscribe to all this stuff. I didn't want to read it as it came out, and I didn't want to pick and choose the articles I like. So I'd sit down for a few hours in a bookstore and keep up to date on the latest information in the fields I was interested in. And then I do that every couple of months, but then probably one every 10 times, maybe every year and a half or so, I would actually buy a magazine because it was so good. I wanted to go back and reread the article multiple times. This is going back to before everything was just online. This is when you had to go to a bookstore. And actually, I like this. A few years ago, I actually looked for an archived copy of this magazine to buy it because I wanted to read this article again. The article was about how in the life of a man, and I think this does apply to women also. I think it does. There are some things I don't think apply to women. There are some things I think mainly apply to men in life. But this particular subject I think equally applies to women. For instance, childbirth, having a child, going through labor. Sorry guys, but that doesn't apply to you. You can even be trans and you still don't get to have that experience. Because it's based on your haploid gametes and what you were born with, and there's no way to change that with any kind of surgery. It's your most fundamental identity, and you either can produce children or you can't. But then there's stuff that's mainly has to do with men. This isn't one of those things, and maybe another day I'll speak about gender differences and differences between sexes. But we're not going to do that today. By the way, I think it's interesting that, when you talk about how many sexes are there generally, if you're in a binary model, there's male and female, right? You also have hermaphroditic entities and asexual entities, and sometimes you want to throw trans entities, but usually when you talk about sex is your gametes. It's purely biological. But when you talk about gender, and you talk about also male and female are also in gender, but people want to separate sex and gender, but then they use the same language for both, which is problematic. If you want to separate gender from sex, what would be important to do that? And if you want to conceive of gender as a social construct and not see it as biological, then it would be important that you came up with a different language. Otherwise, people get confused. If male and female is your gender identity and male and female is also your sex identity, you have a problem because the social construct and the biological construct use the same language, and it gets really confusing for people. Do you follow that? So if you want to separate gender from sex, it's important that you come up with a different language for gender, which is more pliable and which can be seen as more of a social construct, and which doesn't immediately make you think of biological distinctions, which are as fundamental as whether you breathe oxygen, underwater and you have gills, or whether you breathe oxygen on land. They're basic fundamental distinctions. Primarily whether you can have children or not, whether you lactate or not. So anyway, I was reading this article, and it was speaking about how every decade a man needs to slay a different dragon. And so in your 20s, the dragon you need to slay is reaching your peak physicality. Because you just get stronger and stronger until you're about 28, 29 years old. And so in your 20s, you should become a physical specimen. Really see what your body's capable of. That can also segue into your 30s. So let's not make it, that on your 30th birthday, you stop being physical. Still chasing that dragon at 50, And so, but that's your 20s. Also education. Of course, that also goes on forever, but there's a formal educational time in somebody's life, and that usually comes to a close in their 20s. Even you go to graduate school, even you get a PhD, even you do a residency, usually not more than 32, 33, and you're getting out of that. Then your 30s are about finding a mate. Your 40s are about raising children. Or your 40s were about making money and your 30s were about finding a mate and having children. I can't remember exactly how it was. Or your 20s might have been about finding a mate. Your 30s about having children. Your 40s about, raising those children and making money. Your 50s about setting yourself up to be financially secure forever. The 50s were definitely about final financial freedom. Although obviously people can work on that and achieve that earlier. But if I remember correctly, and again, I couldn't find the article again, so I can't be sure. And it doesn't really matter what the author thought because I'm now 50 and I can speak to this from experience. Your 20s, you're exploring education. You're exploring your physique. You're exploring your physical abilities and you're looking for your mate. Your 30s, you're finding your mate. You're starting a family and you're establishing yourself in your field. In your 40s, you're raising kids and you're establishing some financial freedom and you're achieving mastery in your chosen field. Sometimes you're going and trying a second field and you're trying something new out because you can start to explore because you've achieved success and you can springboard. In your 50s, you start to, you're marrying your kids off. You're finishing that aspect of your life of raising a family and you're setting yourself up for retirement. And then he spoke about your 60s. And your 60s, you're fighting lethargy. And you're trying to stay vital. And you're trying to give something back and create a legacy and die peacefully. It just goes on in your 70s and 80s. And you're doing some of this stuff. Creating legacy. Letting go. Spirituality. Not succumbing to old age. Not succumbing to weakness of mind and weakness of body. And finishing with some grace. And ultimately dying. But he was saying how, every 10 years or so, there's a different dragon you have to slay. And it really resonated with me. It had that effect when you read something and you think to yourself, oh, this is true. We have some version of this with our Brahmacharya, Grihastha, Vanaprastha, and Sannyas, the 4 stages of life, which is supposed to last over 100 years, but people don't generally live to be 100, so it's usually more like 80 years, every 20 years. 20 years of student life, 20 years of family life, 20 years renouncing the world, and then 20 years of being fully renounced and giving back. So we have the same thing. 20, 25 years of growth. We could break it up a little more, right? You have your childhood, and you have your educational life. Within that first 25 years, there's your childhood and your educational life. You can even break that up further. Your childhood, your teenage years, and then your higher educational life. Then the next 25 years, which is usually more like about 40 years for people. People usually get married for more like 40 years in Kali Yuga. And so, you're going to get married. You're going to enjoy early married life. You're going to have a family. You're going to raise that family. Then you're going to enjoy life on the back end. You got to make a bunch of money. You got to put some money away. And achieve mastery in your chosen career, find some security, and then the next phase of life, you're starting to let go, you're starting to give back, you're starting to create legacy, you're trying to stay vital. So however you do it, there are these natural trajectories of life. Krishna claims they come from him. He claims that these different ashrams come from him. And we certainly see that, when you read world literature, people have this idea of these different trajectories of your life and these different periods in your life. And if you look objectively speaking across a wide variety of cultures in the world, you find that people naturally do have these basic, grades that they go through in life, these different periods they go through in their life, these different elements, time-wise, chronologically in a person's life. And now I'm 50. 50. Panchas urdvam vanam brajet. At the age of 50, you go to the forest to achieve self-realization. 50 is a big one in the Vedic tradition. It's the renunciation of married life. And as I turn 50, I got a 5-year-old, so I'm still in it for another minute or two because I got a 5-year-old. But even having a 5-year-old at the age of 50, it's weird. And it's weird because I've also got a 21-year-old who's going to get married next year. 6 months. My eldest will be married. And, who knows? A couple of years from now, I could have grandkids. So, my grandkids might be 8, 9 years younger than my youngest. We had a reasonably large family over a reasonably large period of time, over the course of 15 years. And so my grandkids may not be that different in age from my own kids. I might have a granddaughter, grandson or granddaughter who's, roughly 8 years younger than my own kid. And that's less difference than between some of my own children. Between my grandchild and my child, there'll be less difference between the uncle and the aunt and the nephew or niece than there is between an older brother and a younger sister. You get it? It's wild, right? It's actually pretty natural. We think it's wild, but it's pretty organic. You do it right, the family just kind of goes on forever. Your youngest kids merge with your kids' oldest kids, and so on. You have this just constant stream of elders and family members. But my wife and I are done having kids. And we're raising our last child, and I'm sad about it. And I'm having the same conversation about cloud makers and smoke with my 5-year-old, but it's not the same as when I had that conversation in my mid-30s with Rukta. Having that conversation at 50 with my daughter is not the same as having that conversation with my son Rukta at 35. Because I'm finishing things up. I'm on the last few holes of that 18-hole course of being a parent and raising children. I'll always be a parent. I'll always do battle for my children. That won't change. But it's different when you have young kids. It's just a different feeling when you're starting out having young kids. And the great unknown from wrapping it up, and you've already done it many times over. Most of you don't know what I'm talking about because you haven't done it. But if you have, then you do know what I'm talking about. And so I think in the same way that there's value in knowing what you're good at and knowing what you were put on this earth to do and knowing what your purpose is and what your swadharma is, knowing what your personal dharma is. I think there's value in that. And then being chaste to that. And we can just broaden that to being, you should know what integrity consists of, what your value. And then you should just learn to just obey your value system. And when temptations come along to pull you from your value system, you should become adept at just saying no thank you. And sticking to your guns. And staying faithful to what it is you value for your whole life. You got to figure it out. That's your younger years. But once you figure it out, then the rest of your life is spent being faithful to that value system. And being faithful to your value system, there's a word for it, and that word is integrity. To be whole. When you live your values. You got to figure out what your values are. And then once you arrive at your value system, you then stay faithful to it. And that's having integrity. That's being whole. Then there's what was I put on this earth to do? And that's value, but it also is how you give back. It's also your career to some extent. Usually, sometimes. Maybe it's a hobby. But there's something you do to give back that goes beyond just your value system. Things like loyalty and honor and honesty and chastity, things like that. It gets more into the what am I going to do to manifest my value and give back in a career? How am I going to contribute to society, to the betterment of the world? How am I going to contribute to my community? What do I do for my community? When do I put myself in harm's way? What's my duty to my people? That goes beyond just integrity, and that gets into a sense of duty. That gets into what we're talking about when we say dharma. What's your swadharma? And then getting comfortable with that. Like, this is who I am. This is why I'm here. This is what I do. This is how I serve. This is how I give back. This is how I contribute. We got to figure that out, too. So there's, what are my values? And then there's, what do I do? And of course there has to be consonance, right? Those two things have to resonate with one another and be congruent with one another to be happy in life. If you're a butcher and a devotee, you're going to be miserable. What you do with your life has to be relatively congruent with what you value. And then you need to add to that a chronological sense of how old am I and where am I at in life. Because there's a natural order of like the lifespan of a given organism. And there's a time to procreate. And there's a time to raise offspring. And there's a time to be done with that. There's like a time. And it's weird, but it's not. Your mind actually changes as you get older. And the things which make sense for you mentally at a certain age won't make sense for you mentally at another age. Just like going back to, you can go back to college, but that whole like bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, idealistic, like I'm just kind of, that whole thing, that's a 20s thing. You go back to college in your 40s, you're not going to have that same experience of joining a sorority or a fraternity or like whatever other stupid stuff people do in college. And, and playing beer pong. And if you are like 45 doing that, you're a loser. You're weird. People are looking at you going, oh, you're that guy. But that sort of idealism, that naive idealism of youth is apropos if you're 20-something. Isn't a good look when you're in your 50s. You're expected no longer to be naive. Maybe still idealistic, but it should be a seasoned idealism. It should be a well-established idealism. Galvanized and fortified by decades of life experience. Strengthening it beyond what some 20-year-old has because they read a Che Guevara pamphlet. I'm as excited and idealistic as I was ever in my life. I am more of an idealist now at the age of 50 than I've ever been at any other time in my life. But it's not naive anymore. It's been earned and fought for, sculpted for 3 decades since I was 20. And so the point I wanted to make today, as I was faced ultimately with my own mortality, ultimately, if you want to break down, I was having a mini existential moment. As I relived, like while being mocked by my daughter, who's more savvy somehow at 5 than my son was at 7, as I'm mocked by my daughter asking me, like, how is that a cloud maker? There's no such thing as a cloud maker. It's making smoke. What's wrong with you, Dad? As I relived that moment, it hit different. I wasn't at the beginning of having a family. I'm at the end of having a family. I wasn't starting it. It wasn't naive. I'm on the tail end of it, wrapping it up. It just feels different. Like when you're coming to the end of a lovely meal, it's just different. Those last few bites of lasagna are different than the first few bites of lasagna. Because the first few bites of lasagna, you're like, I got this epic tray of vegan lasagna in front of me. I'm going to be able to oh my God, it's going to be so yummy. And those last few bites, you're like, should I eat these last few bites? Do I need this? And you're like, or if you want more, and that was the end of your entree because they served you too small a portion, you're like, oh, this sucks. And you savor those last morsels sometimes even more than the first ones. You're wolfing down the first ones, but those last ones you're like, oh, it's my last few bites. And they hit different. Life is like that. The last few bites of a bowl of ice cream. When you know there's no more. You killed the pint. You know there's no more. Those last few bites, they hit different. There's a certain melancholy, pensive, thoughtful, really anticipating loss feature to them. And ideally, a little bit of grace in letting go. But your life has certain arcs and certain trajectories and certain compartments. And it's set up that way biologically and chronologically, based on your lifespan, based on procreating, based on when you have the energy and the mindset to get stuff done, based on what is, when you talk to philosophers in their 60s and early 70s, they're doing their best work because their mind is the sharpest. Their body is long since begun to decline substantially, but their mind, they do their best work. They do their best work. Usually mixed martial artists do their best work in their 30s. Boxing, their best work is in their 20s. Maybe late 20s. Mixed martial arts lasts a little longer, mid-30s. Philosophy, well into your 60s and 70s. But there's an arc to everything you do. And there's a time when you're in the belly. Just like when you swing a baseball bat. Same principle is true in punching and kicking. But if you swing a baseball bat, if the bat contacts the ball right here, there's very little strength. If the bat contacts the ball right here, there's very little strength. You want to contact the ball right there in the middle where you're strong. In the middle of your swing, right there is where you have the most strength. So you want to orient yourself to the ball and swing so that in the power of your swing, when you're generating the most force, that's when you contact the ball. And so when you have kids, when you get married, when you work on your career, when you work on it. So if you're in your 20s, what should you be working on? Personal integrity. Celibacy, monogamy, chastity, honor, honesty, strength, character, education. You become solid. Then once you've done that, what do you do next? What do you next? Find a mate. You got it? And while you're finding a mate, what else do you do? Figure out a way to make some money, right? What were you going to say? Yeah, well, you got to find a mate first, right? And figure out how to make some money, right? So and then have a family. You get it? It's like it's an arc, right? Get your act together. Partner up with somebody if you're going to do that. Make some money. Have a family. You follow? And then raise that family. And then start to work on legacy, giving back. Retiring. Adventure again, but on the back end, it's going to hit different than the front end. Because you don't have your whole life ahead of you. You're on the back nine. A little bittersweet. Old people are happier than young people. In happiness studies, old people score better. Because they know they're going to die, and so they stop sweating the small stuff. Because they know they're going to die, and their mortality is in front of them, and so they savor it more, they appreciate it more. Anyway, we'll look at a verse real quick. One I thought of in case I wanted to quote a verse. Interestingly enough, I lost my sight. I used to have I had 20/15 vision. I could see at 20 feet what everybody else could see at 50. I still have 20/15 vision, but my nearsightedness, looking at stuff close is gone. I hate the idea of wearing glasses on my face. Primarily because I want to get socked in the face while I'm wearing glasses. My life is lived anticipating, some kind of violent conflict on the daily, and so I want to make sure I don't, you know what I mean? I think like that. But when was the last time somebody socked me in the face, Just like on the street, right? But the thing, I can't wear glasses, because who knows? If somebody socks me in the face and wearing glasses, I might get injured. Shruti vipratipanate yada stasyati nischala samadhau shruti buddhis tada yogam avapsyasi. Here's the verse I wanted. Yadate moha kalilam buddhir yatarishyati. When your intelligence has passed beyond the thicket of illusion. Moha kalila. When your buddhi is vyati tarishyati, when it will pass beyond, when it will transcend moha kalila, the thicket of illusion. Yada, when that happens, yadaste moha kalilam buddhi vyatarishyati, when your intelligence passes beyond the thicket of illusion. Tada gantasi nirvedam. Gantasi nirvedam shrotayasya shrutasya cha. Then at that time you will go to a place of indifference towards what has been heard and what will be heard. I'm feeling like this now at 50. That at the age of 50, kind of coming through being a father and raising my children and getting ready to watch them get married and have their own children. Coming through that, I feel a certain indifference. Tada gantasi nirvedam. You'll become indifferent. You'll go to a place of indifference. When you've got enough distance and you're out of the forest enough and you can look back and see it for what it was. Maybe you're still in it, but you're out of the thick of it and you can start to see from a vantage point above, you can start to see the lay of the land of your life, of what you're doing here, what this world consists of. With birth and death and growth and old age and having a family and then giving it all up and creating a legacy and eventually passing on like that. You've got enough distance. You're high up enough in elevation that you can see what's going on. Tada gantasi nirvedam. At that time you'll go to a place of indifference. Shrotyasya shrutasya cha. Towards what will be heard and what has been heard. And so I was feeling a certain sobriety. Yasaste moha kalilam buddhi yatarishati. Tada gantasi nirvedham shrotyasya shrutasya cha. When you've got enough time in and you've done it right, you're high up enough on the mountain, you can look back over and you can survey it all. And you can see what has been and what will be. What was theoretical has now become realized. And you can see it for what it is. The temporariness of this world, the joy and sorrow inherent in this world, the growth and death in this world, the birth and death in this world, the different ages you have to pass through, that you don't get to go back and do it all again. That there's a season for everything in life. And that you need to learn to flow with that season and realize you don't just write your own ticket, but by being born as a human being into this world, there's a certain biological imperative, a certain mental construct that goes along with that biological imperative, and a certain lifespan of your organism, and you're born into a river with a flow, and you got to get with that flow and feel it, and then you move on. At a certain point you can look back and you can see that, how that river came down. You can track it. You're not in the thick of it anymore. You guys feeling me? That's what I wanted to share today. And amazingly, I'm still in it because I'm still raising my daughter, but it's not the same. It doesn't hit the same. I'm feeling it different. And so the best advice I have to wrap it all up is we need to learn to be our age. Like my daughter's 5. Sometimes she'll wear an outfit. She'll be like, look, I look like a teenager. She'll actually say that. Like she literally says those exact words. Don't I look like a teenager, Daddy? And then, her sister Shardia, who is her teenager role model, because Shardia is a teenager and she's a girl. Sometimes my daughter Nayika will sing a song. She'll be like, I'm so tired. I'm a teenager. Because Shiva's always like, I'm just tired. So sometimes she's related like this, this mild depression, masqueraded as exhaustion, as what it means to be a teenager. So you get to wear crop tops and you get to be tired all the time. And that's what it means to be a teenager. And so... yeah, the advice I have to wrap this whole thing up is that there is a trajectory of life. And your mindset actually goes along with the age of your organism. And it doesn't mean you can't be vital. It doesn't mean you can't be excited. It doesn't mean you can't have fresh eyes every single day and be looking at the world as amazing. I feel that way. But it does mean that over the course of your life, you gain perspective and you gain depth and sobriety. And it hits different at 30, at 40, at 50, and I'm anticipating at 60 or 70. And some of your finest work mentally will be done as you get older. And so there's a move from physical to mental. There's a move from personal development to family development, to legacy. There's a move from education to earning to retiring. There's a move from working on yourself to finding a mate, to having a family, to raising that family, to letting go of that family. There's a move from being naive to being sober and thoughtful as you get older. There's a move from acquiring things to letting things go. And the same way you got to figure out what are your basic values, and then you got to figure out what are you going to do to manifest those in terms of your career. And then you got to find a mate that goes along with that. You know, and then you got, like, the same way you got to, like, there are these different arcs of your life. There's different mindsets that go along with them. Some of them are chronological. Some of them you have to do A before you can do B. So you have your challenge in front of you, and then once you've passed that, once you cross that bridge, you can go to the next bridge on your journey. Some of them are straight biologically controlled. And you're part of something bigger than yourself, and you got to learn to flow with it. And part of that flow is letting go. That was the point I wanted to make. And so, we got to figure out the age we're at and then do that thing so that we're not playing catch up 10 years from now. You get it? So you got to be your age now so that you don't have to play catch up and act like you're 30 when you're 50. And act like you're 30 when you're 60. You got to cross that bridge because your mindset and your body and time doesn't wait. Does that make sense? All right, thank you, IGTV. Give me some feedback.